Friends, it's been quite a week. As some have said, the events almost 20 years ago now, believe it or not, of 9/11 violently kind of grabbed us nationally by the shoulders and shook us awake to the understanding of our vulnerability to foreign acts of terrorism on our soil. And now January the 6th, 2021, Epiphany was a day that also kind of grabbed us and shook us and held a moral mirror up to our collective identity and drove home the sad fact that domestic terrorism, that the division that divides us and is tearing us apart, is the cancer that we need to recognize and work against, repent of, and treat together. And certainly there have been certain groups in our nation that have experienced this and known this truth before some of the rest of us were violently made to understand the sadness, the violence of this truth. I watched and really appreciated Kristen's sermon last week, and the ideas that she shared and quoted from Walter Brueggemann, who's one of my favorite theologians, and his notion that the biblical prophets that we read of in the Old Testament were, and really throughout the scriptures, were, as he says, emancipated imaginers. I love that. Emancipated imaginers of the alternative. That these prophets, and not limited to prophets in the Bible, but prophets are people with feet planted firmly on the ground of their day and into the ground of the issues of their day, with grief having stripped away from their theology any pithy notions of God or humanity. God's Spirit blessed these prophets with an imagination that freed them and can free us from the despair of how things have to be. It reminds us that the power and the creativity of the God that we worship, and strengthened with the hope of that reminder, allows us to reimagine who we can be and what we can do together. Prophetic imagination. This weekend, our nation celebrates one of our greatest prophets, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And before he was assassinated, he had actually stepped away for a few months from public life, and he had gone away to write a book. He didn't know it was going to be his final book, but it ended up being so. It was later published posthumously. The title was "Where Do We Go From Here? Community or Chaos?" In the foreword to that book, Vincent Harding shares a story from the 1964 Democratic National Convention. There, Mississippi's Fannie Lou Hamer spoke powerfully against the fact that delegations were segregated racially at the convention. She spoke against this, and afterwards a reporter asked her, he said, "Are you, Ms. Hamer, seeking equality with the white man?" And she answered by saying this, and I love this. She said, "Why would I fight for equality with the white man? We don't want to be that low. We don't want to be that low." She said, "I want a democracy that will raise me and the white man up together." Do you see that? That's prophetic imagination. The difference between the reporter's question of comparison and Hamer's answer of community, that is prophetic imagination, reframing away from comparison and toward community, lifting everybody up rather than comparing us to each other. Dr. King had a similar vision for our nation and the world in the late 60s when he and other Black leaders of the civil rights movement were expanding their call to encompass not just Black lives, but all who were left behind, all who were left out and stuck in poverty in our nation. It's interesting, I was born in May of 1968, and that just so happened to be right between, just a month earlier and a month later, the assassination of Dr. King and the assassination of Robert Kennedy. You think about that spring of 1968 and the deep turmoil and division and deadly violence that we were dealing with as a family, as a nation, somewhat similar to how some of us feel today in this year. King's question then, and the question that echoes into our living rooms and our nation today is, where do we go from here? When we find ourselves in a place of deep misunderstanding and deep conflict, do we dive into the chaos and the violence, or can we prophetically, creatively shape together a new notion, a new type of community? In order for us to be imaginative prophets the way we want to be, we've got to first do one thing. We've got to recognize and reject really the barriers or limitations that keep us from being more holistically, more inspirationally creative. The fact of the matter is, we engineer a lot of the conflict, a lot of the walls that we see in life. We engineer them in our own minds, in our own hearts, in just the way that we frame things, in the way that we understand challenges. And basically it comes down to, we frame things, challenges like we experience today, as this versus that. It's this way or it's that way. You agree with us or you agree with them. It's you took it and I want it back. But the fact is, as Christians, as followers of Christ, as people filled with the Spirit of God, that's not how God created the world. God is not constrained by the despair of our narrow political or social categorizations. And we can't allow ourselves to be either. Now, maybe you've seen this problem before. I want to share something with you. I'm going to share my screen and put before you a conundrum. Again, you might have seen this problem before, but it looks like this. This is just kind of an example of imaginative, prophetic imagination. So here's the problem. Don't unmute if you know the answer, okay? The problem is this. You have got to draw 4 straight lines to connect these 9 dots. And the challenge is this: once you put your pencil down on the paper or your finger or whatever, you can't lift it up. So you've got to draw 4 straight lines without lifting your pencil to connect all of these dots. And you've got to connect them all with just the 4. And can you do it? So in your mind, or just think about it, how would you put your pencil down on one of these dots? You got to start on one of the dots and then draw 4 straight lines. They can't bend, they can't twist. And you've got to be able to connect all of the dots with those 4 lines. Now, if you've been through this before and you know how this works, it is what I would say it is an example of how prophetic imagination works and what we need to employ as a people. All right, here you go. 4 lines. Number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. Well, some might say that you broke the rules. You can't do that. Well, no, you can actually. There's no limits. What our brains, what our hearts, what our minds, sometimes what society will tell us, what our politics will tell us, is that you've got to stay within the constraints of this box. No, you don't. You've got to continue to frame things as this versus that, or there's got to be what we would call an understanding of scarcity. There's only so much, and you've got to work within these boundaries. That's actually not true. The fact is, our God works out here as much as God works in here. And we've got to expand ourselves to recognize that a lot of the creativity, a lot of the solutions in life happen outside when we allow our minds, we allow our hearts to be broken open. We allow ourselves to experience the grace and the creativity of what it looks like to be prophetically imaginative people. What we tend to do is we tend to see ourselves and others as kind of existing, right, alongside each other, bumping up against each other, comparing ourselves to each other. You've got more, you've got less, you've got bigger, storehouses, you've got smaller, whatever. And the fact is, God is consistently looking down upon all us, right? And God just sees one family and calls us to do the same. If we want to know joy, if we want to know collective community together in ways that benefit all of us, we have got to start employing outside of the box, creative, imaginative thinking. If we want to be people who are influenced by the better, more creative angels of our nature, then we've got to start reading and listening and watching and hanging out with the better angels. If all we're doing is spending time listening to and following the example of those who are sharpening their swords, screaming for revenge, and sharing how unfair it is for us and people like us, even if we believe that we have history and righteousness on our side, if that's what we are doing, we are going to get a war. And the problem with wars is that they only end when you have destroyed your opponent. But as Dr. King reminds us, we are woven together as humans in a common garment of destiny. And as Chad and Geneva read to us this morning, when one of us suffers, all of us suffer. So if you destroy them, you're actually destroying yourself. You're destroying all of us. Now, does that mean that we don't then engage in conflict? We stay away from it, right? No, not at all. That's not what that means. Conflict and disagreements, we will have them. We need to have them. They're not the problem. The problem is the limitations on how we think about conflict, the limitations on how we deal with division and problems, right? As long as we frame it and we keep it within the constraints of winning or losing, of those idiots and then those of us who are enlightened, all of us are in trouble. The scripture that I want to read for us this morning comes from the book of 1 Samuel. And it's a story that perhaps you have heard before. And it's an example, at least the way I understand it and the way I've read it this week, of how you can have two powerful characters who feel like they've got history on their side, righteousness on their side, God on their side, and how they can have conflict without destroying each other, how they can deal with the misunderstanding, the frustration, even the hatred, even the craziness and the violence in a way that affirms the other and understands that we all need to be blessed or we're all going to be in trouble together. So the story comes from, I'm going to read it from 1 Samuel chapter 24. And it is the story of King David before he was king. And probably you know this, but King David was before he was king was a young man. He was a shepherd, and he had some early success in battle, and he was kind of recruited to live with King Saul. He was recruited to live in the palace with King Saul and became a partner, a brother to King Saul's David, King Saul's son, Jonathan. And so David was kind of a son to Saul, but as God blessed David and worked in David's life, Saul got jealous of David. And in fact began to go after him. Saul's kind of started losing his mind and started being violent towards David to the point where David had to flee, and he had a group of folks that surrounded him and left with him. Saul went after David and sought to destroy him because he saw him, this one that was part of his family, right? I mean, do you see the metaphor here? One who is a part of his family as suddenly being one that he was jealous of, and one that was trying to take something that was his. And so the text finds Saul out searching for David and seeking to destroy him. Reading from 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 1. So now, even as Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was fighting the Philistines, he was informed that David was in the wilderness. And so Saul took 3,000 men and selected for them from Israel and went to look for David and his soldiers near the rocks of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens beside the road, and there was a cave. Saul went in to the cave to relieve himself, to use the restroom. Meanwhile, David and his soldiers were sitting in the very back of that same cave, hiding. David's soldiers whispered to him. They said, "This is the day the Lord has spoke of when he promised to you, I will hand your enemy over to you. You can do with him whatever you think best." And so David snuck up as Saul was busy and cut off a corner of Saul's robe without Saul recognizing it. Immediately, David felt guilty. He felt horrible that he had cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Saul was still the king. He went back to his men and he said, "The Lord forbid that I should ever do something like this to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lift my hand against him, because he is God's anointed." So David held his soldiers in check, right? I know you want me to do this. I know you want me to kill him. You want me to destroy him. I'm not going to do it. David held his soldiers in check, and he said that he wouldn't allow them to attack Saul. Then Saul left the cave and went on his way. And so here's the picture that you're looking at. Saul is walking away, and David then comes out of the cave and he yells after Saul, "My master, the king." And Saul looked back, and David bowed low out of respect with his nose to the ground. And David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the people when you say David wants to ruin you?" Why do we listen to the people when they say that David wants to ruin you, when others just want to ruin you? Why do we allow ourselves to get caught up in those lies? Look, today your own eyes have seen that the Lord handed you over to me in this cave, but I refused to kill you. I spared you, saying, "I won't lift a hand against my master because he is the Lord's anointed. Look here, my protector. See the corner of your robe in my hand. I cut it off, but I wouldn't kill you. So now know that I am not guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I haven't wronged you, but you're hunting me down, trying to kill me. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord take vengeance on you for me, but I will not lift a hand against you." And as the old proverb goes, evil deeds come from evil doers, but I won't lift a hand against you. So who is Israel's king coming after? Who are you chasing? Am I a dead dog, a single flea? May the Lord be the judge. And as soon as David finished saying all this to Saul, Saul said, "David, my son, is that your voice?" And then he broke down in tears, telling David, "You are more righteous than I, because you have treated me more generously. I have treated you terribly. Today you have told me the good that you have done for me, how the Lord handed me over to you, but how you didn't try to kill me. When someone finds an enemy, do they send the enemy away in peace? May the Lord repay you with good for what you have done for me today. Now even I know that you will become king, and Israel's kingdom will flourish." Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. To see how David did that, didn't back away from conflict, right? It was going to be a hard conversation. It was going to be difficult, going to confront the problem, the evil, and say, "God, be the judge here, but I will not see you as my enemy. I will not seek to destroy you. I will confront you. We will deal with this, but we're going to deal with it in a way that lifts us both up and blesses the nation." We've seen this work of prophetic imagination, this kind of healing and restoration throughout our history as humans, right? Often in response to years of conflict and one side feeling unable or unwilling to share or yield or engage in the difficult process of listening and learning and being saved together. One Christian philosopher who I've read and I've grown to really appreciate is a gentleman named Peter Rollins. He comes from northern Italy. I'm not northern Italy, northern Ireland. And as a boy, he grew up in the Troubles. During the Troubles, that was the horrible time of violence and terror that tore apart Christians in Northern Ireland, right? They were just Protestants and Catholics. They were from the same family. They were from the same nation, and yet they were hating each other. They were perpetuating violence upon each other, destroying families. The Troubles and those decades of terror and hatred taught Rollins and many others who had been through that division about the necessity of engaged and creative conflict, the necessity of engaging in creative conflict, and the utter destruction of oppositional war. Rollins is a Christian, and he would probably be seen as he's a PhD. He'd probably be seen as a more liberal scholar. But one of the things he says, I don't like the word progressive. He says, once you put yourself on a scale like that, you see yourself as progressive, then that means people who aren't like you aren't as progressive as you. And when you try to engage in dialogue with them, it comes across as paternalistic. He said, we've got to break ourselves from those spectrums, right? From those limits. We've got to see all of us as being in this family together. And if we destroy the other, we destroy ourselves. We have to move away, he says, from conversion politics. We've got to be saved from conversion theology as Christians. Prophetic imagination expands our view of what salvation looks like. And it's not conversion. Our job, friends, we got to hear this. Our job is not to convert others. Our job is to love them. And for us to engage then, and however that means, in uncomfortable conflict in ways that are generative. If we're not willing to deal with conflict in generative ways, you know better than me the conflict in your family and in your life, and when it is good to kind of take a pause and step away, and when it is to engage. But if we start to see the other as our enemy, as we start to engage in warlike tactics, it will end with the destruction of all of us. If we can shift it and understand conflict and dealing with these things in comfortable ways, even if it takes months, even if it takes years, if we can stay at that table when we have to believe with our prophetic imagination that God can work out of that creative new ways of being, it's out of that conflict that new ideas emerge and things like the Good Friday Accords can be signed. I want to end by closing thoughts from Dr. King's book, Where Do We Go From Here? If you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, there are some book studies that are going to be reading through it. King says this. He says, the rich nations in our world must use their vast resources of wealth to develop the underdeveloped, to school the unschooled, to feed the unfed. The well-off and the secure have too often become indifferent and oblivious to the poverty and deprivation in their midst. The poor in our countries have been shut out of our minds, driven from the mainstream of our society because we have allowed them to become invisible. Ultimately, a great nation is a compassionate nation. No individual or nation can be great if it does not have a concern for the least of these. Friends, in the face of chaotic division, I believe that we can be a people who commit ourselves to imagining a better way, a way out of chaos and into community. We've done this before. We have found ways to see beyond the hate and allowed God to expand the circle. Where we think there's not enough, God has a way of simply setting more plates. And instead of running out, our table runs over with more love, more forgiveness, and abundance. It sounds crazy, but it's true. And it requires prophetic imagination on all of our parts to get there. Friends, may we join our voices as part of God's prophetic chorus and believe that not just some, but every voice can and should be raised and heard. And that when we lift every voice, we are blessed by the harmony of liberty and faith and hope as we walk together through these difficult valleys into the hope of community. Friends, I want us to end this sermon time with turning our hearts, wherever you are, to some prayer and reflection, and asking God to use you this week, next week, this month, this year ahead, these years ahead, that God would use us, would use you to be a prophetic voice. And as we reflect on that, we do so in listening to Stanford Choir's incredible rendition, a pandemic rendition, socially distanced rendition of James Weldon Johnson's Lift Every Voice and Sing. Let us listen and pray together.